We hope that you will be part of our community and join us in future endeavors. And we want to thank our panelists today, the esteemed Senator Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire, David Brooks, Yael Eisenstadt, and at the conclusion of our program live from Tel Aviv, Dr. Michael Drescher, the ER and Trauma Director at Israel's Rabin Medical Center. At this time, I'd like to thank and welcome our esteemed host and moderator, Robert Siegel, who for 40 years was National Public Radio's host of All Things Considered. Thank you, Robert, and enjoy our event.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. I have to be honest, I was only host of All Things Considered for 31 years, but I spent another decade working for NPR. Like so many Americans, I've spent the past few months stunned by the changes that we've experienced, changes in our daily routines and how we deal with our family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, local merchants, changes in economic confidence, and changes in social and political attitudes. In this series of web seminars that the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center is producing, we're seeking to understand those changes, and we're looking for solutions, for ways to instill or restore trust in our democracy. We call it Navigating the New Abnormal. Today we're going to hear from three panelists, as Josh Plout just said, who are trying to make sense of this season of profound change. After I interview them, I'll ask them the questions that you submit using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll hear from Senator Jeanne Shaheen, Democrat of New Hampshire, and from Yael Eisenstadt, a former CIA officer who's now focused on the threat posed by Facebook to our national political discourse. And we'll talk with New York Times columnist and author David Brooks about how we as a country are coping with the multiple crises that confront us. And at the end of the hour, we'll check in with Dr. Michael Drescher, who directs the emergency department at Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva, Israel, for an update on the coronavirus pandemic. We start with David Brooks, whose most recent book is The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life. David, first of all, welcome. It's great to see you, even in this way that we now see people, and to talk with you. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you. I shared 20 of your 31 years on All Things Considered.
On All Things Considered, we're there regularly. And as I said in our first webinar in which E.J. Dion was on, you were the two guys I know who know politics as a scholarly discipline and as a reporter's beat. And it's a rare depth that you bring to those questions. A few weeks ago, you wrote about the 5 epic crises the U.S. faces these days: fighting COVID-19, taking on board what African Americans experience when they confront the police, also a political realignment, the rise of a social justice ideology, and of course the economic crisis. When you survey this landscape of crises, are you struck by American resilience and grit, or are you struck by our national shortcomings that we're displaying in the face of all those challenges?
Yeah, I've added a 6th crisis, or a 6th transition, which is a generational shift. I think a younger generation in every organization I'm familiar with is one demanding power and taking power. And so that it's made it the hardest time in my career to figure out what's going on, to be a commentator, because you don't know which is important, which is not. And at first in the pandemic, around March and April, I was writing a piece for The Atlantic called The Year That Made America. And my thesis was that we were pulling together in a time of crisis. And despite whatever was happening in the White House, which I think is a disaster, the American people in neighborhood after neighborhood, everybody I was interviewing was really impressed by people around them. And so I stuck with that very optimistic take for about 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. And it's just impossible to maintain that. So now I think I'm going to write a piece called The Year That Broke America. And what's broken is, first of all, our trust in one another, our inability to believe that the people around us are trustworthy and they'll help us out and we'll help them out. What's broken is our emotional state. A third of Americans are suffering from clinical levels of depression and anxiety, according to the Census Bureau. And what's broken is polarization. What had been a depolarized time is now a widely polarized time. And so perceptions of the pandemic, perceptions of masks, everything is now once again seen through red-blue lenses. And so this has been just a depressing period, as almost every institution and every social connection in our society has failed to perform.
Yeah, I was going to mention the politicization of the mask as a measure of what's happened this year. We may have a truce in that particular war, as the president endorsed mask wearing this week. But do you see any positive signs out of this mess that we're in right now?
Yeah, I guess a couple. I think the racial reckoning has been a very positive sign. I mean, if you look at how white Americans now view the Black experience, I think they have a much more realistic view of the injustices that African Americans face every day. I think that's very positive. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, we, in my view, are leaving a deadlocked 50-50 America. We started the year where Republicans had 49% support and Democrats had 47. Right now, Democrats have 50 and Republicans have 39, an 11-point swing in party affiliation in just 6 months. That's astonishing. President Trump's numbers have just collapsed. I think maybe it'll change, but I think, to me, this is what a political realignment smells like. And we go back to the days where we had a sun party, the Democrats, and a moon party, the Republicans.
And I should add, we're having a little problem with your Zoom connection, but I could follow everything that you said there. As for what you've described as the quasi-religion of social justice, which has become very popular, perhaps especially with the younger generation, but not only, as you point out, it's much easier to respond to demands for symbolic gestures or amended narratives than with substantive policy. To me, it's summed up by a peculiar non sequitur of this year that in the spring, the third highest rate of infection in the US after New York City and the Jersey suburbs was the Navajo Nation. And the Washington football team will not be called the Redskins again in the fall. There seems to be an enormous chasm between the gravity of the crises we're seeing on display and the kinds of fixes that we're seeing.
Yeah, and the social justice movement, I agree with a lot of its goals, but it emerged from the universities and it emerged from a certain theory of critical theory. And so it focuses a lot on cultural symbols and words and language. And should Black be uppercase or lowercase? And I'm perfectly willing to go with whatever people want. And with the Redskins, if Native Americans don't like it, fine. It's impolite to impose a name that's insulting to people. But when you've got 14% unemployment, when 150,000, whatever it is, are dying, it just seems to me we need actual change. And the injustices that have been exposed by the disease, the African Americans dying at twice the rates, getting infected at way higher rates, the disparities of income and wealth, that requires legislation. As I wrote in that column, it's more C-SPAN than Instagram.
Yeah.
And so posting on social media is just inadequate. And, I said in there, I thank God Joe Biden has got the nomination because he's someone with legislative experience. He's someone who just does not do cultural politics. That's just not how he thinks. He sort of escaped the 60s without being on either side of the culture war. And so if he can have a set of policies, which he's indeed now unrolling, I'm much happier to talk about that than being stuck in Donald Trump's perpetual TV reality, the culture war. And so I'm hoping we'll end the culture war. So my problem with the social justice is cultural agitation. How does that lead to change? What's the theory of change? And I don't think there's an adequate one.
As you alluded to earlier, and I think this is when journalists are in the thick of any story that they're trying to report on, in the middle of it, we don't really know whether we're at the beginning, middle, or the end, where things are headed, how it will wrap up. I wonder, as hard as it is to sort out what of this season of change might permanently affect American life and what seems to be perhaps more ephemeral. Do you have any thoughts about what's likely to stick from all this?
Yeah, I go into it focusing on the whole situation through the lens of social trust. So in the 1950s, 60s, 40s, 80% of Americans trusted their institutions. And so they could be effective. Now it's down to 19%. In a generation ago, 55% of Americans say, yeah, my neighbors are trustworthy. Now it's down to 31%. And this is very age related. So boomers or silent generation have a high trust in their neighborhoods. Millennials and Gen Z, it's about 17%. low trust. If you ask millennials or Gen Z, are most people selfish and only out for themselves? 71% say yes. It's very hard to do a collective action problem like tackling a pandemic without trust. It's very hard to have a successful society. And so my fear right now is that young people in particular, who are still forming their mentality, are looking at society and saying this place is not trustworthy. And if that happens, it's very hard to have an economy, because trust is the lubricant. It's very hard for people to have spontaneous sociability, the ability to organize with your neighbors to do stuff. And so you really are throwing sand in the gears of the whole society. And that's why a very optimistic person like me is pessimistic at this moment, because the chance to rebuild trust has been forfeited, at least so far. And once you lose trust, it's very hard to know how to regain it.
You know, David, I'm retired, and the idea of isolation or self-quarantine when you're retired, is a lot less challenging than trying to deal with the world every day and work. And I'm curious what it's been like. That is, one reading of this season is that lots of people who used to go to offices are never going to go back to offices. They're going to stay at home and work from there, and the offices are going to be half empty. I mean, I'm just curious personally, what has it been like writing about the state of the country from the confines of your home?
Inadequate. Our friend EJ Dionne is a hugger. Yeah. And if you're on EJ, he's hugging you. I am not a hugger. I once covered Bill Clinton, and he had his arm around me during an interview, and I would skirl away because I'm just not comfortable with it. And even I am desperate for hugging. And when I do a story, if you don't go to a place, you don't know it. And so I can't cover New Hampshire if I'm sitting here in Maryland. And so I think there's a great loss of connection, but also a loss of intelligence. It's well established in social science literature that groups that are in person are much smarter in making decisions than groups electronically. For me, it has been, I'm blessed. I don't have little kids, and I'm in a beautiful spot. But I think it's easy to underestimate how much emotional strain and how much mental strain. I'm tired every morning by 11 a.m. Is caused by just the lack of energizing human connection. And that's true for me. I asked my readers, the Times readers, to send in essays on how you're doing. 6,500 wrote me, and it was devastating. It was a sense of loss of control, runaway anxiety, especially for young parents, especially for working moms. And so I think it's easy to underestimate how much emotionally trying this has been. Gallup does a study where they ask, how's your well-being? We've suffered the greatest drop in well-being in American history. And the time they compared this to was there was a similar drop in well-being in Tunisia before the Arab Spring. And so you expect uprisings in a time of emotional stress and trauma, which I think this has been a long episode of.
Well, David, hang around because in about 20 minutes we'll have the Q&A session, and attendees will be able to put questions to you. But David Brooks of the New York Times, thanks as always for your thoughts. It's been great seeing you. Joining us now is Senator Jeanne Shaheen. She is a New Hampshire Democrat. She's seeking a third term in office this year. She's a former governor of the state, also former director of Harvard University's Institute of Politics. Senator Shaheen, thank you very much for helping us navigate the new abnormal today. You've expressed concern about restoring civic discourse and bipartisanship to our political life. What's something concrete that might come out of this experience of this year that would mark a change in that direction?
Well, first of all, Robert, let me say that we're in the middle of a thunderstorm here in Washington, and so that may have an impact on the technology. So I may come in and out occasionally, but I will be back. You lose me. I think I hope that what will come out of this is some of the things that David talked about, that there will be a response to the big challenges that are facing this country, and that people will recognize that we've got to work together, as has happened in so many places in response to this pandemic. I think nothing really gets done in Washington without bipartisan support. And in order to do that, we need to think about ways to improve bipartisanship and get people to work better together. I think there are some structural changes that would make that happen better. One is to deal with the campaign finance system that we have. We have too much money in politics right now. That affects how people in elective office, particularly in Congress, respond. I think we have a system of gerrymandering. That means that we don't have to discuss with people who disagree with us what their views are, and really listen to views that may be opposing to our own. We have the filibuster in the Senate, which, while I don't think we should get rid of it, I think it needs reform. We need to restore civics education in our schools. So there are a number of things that I think we could do that would improve that civic discourse in a way that would be good for the country. And obviously, I support a change in leadership. Yeah. I think a president who is not, doesn't get up every morning and think about how to divide the country, but thinks about how to unite us, is something that would go a long way, because leadership really does make a difference.
I want to pursue the question of the filibuster, which you mentioned. There are some forecasts out there that this could be a very good Democratic year, and there could be a Democratic majority in the Senate, and that Biden, at this point in the polls, is running ahead of President Trump. But I haven't seen any polls suggesting 60 Democratic seats.
Right.
And 60 is what you need to legislate. In the old days, our parties were odd coalitions of different groups, so that there would be a number of Republicans who were more liberal than the most conservative Democrats, and a number of Democrats more conservative than the most liberal Republicans. Now we have rational parties. So it seems as if bipartisanship would seem to be almost impossible to achieve. That is, when you look across the aisle, all the Arlen Specters became Democrats, all the Shelbys, became Republicans. Is it realistic to think in terms of getting 60 votes for everything, or is it time to say enough of this 60 vote business? If you have 51 votes, that's a majority. That's how the House of Commons does it in Britain. We can legislate that way too.
Well, I think it's something that we need to examine very closely. I think there are ways to reform the filibuster that would make it work better. But, our country was built on majority rule and minority rights. And one of the things that the filibuster is designed to do is to protect those minority rights. Unfortunately, what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 decades is an increasing use of the filibuster to prevent things from happening. When I first got to the Senate back in 2009, I thought we needed to get rid of the filibuster because I was in the majority, and, Democrats controlled the White House. And so we were able to get things done, and we were prevented from doing that by this pesky Republican minority. Now that I'm in the pesky Democratic minority, I'm less inclined to think that we should get rid of the filibuster, because there are a lot of legislative priorities that I think would be undone by the majority in a way that I think would not be good for the country. But having said that, I do think there are ways to make changes in it. When we think about the filibuster, we think about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and the idea that somebody's going to stand up and talk to the issue for hours at a time, like we saw with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, where we saw numerous people control the floor and prevent something from happening back in the 60s. That's not the way it happens today. And maybe we need to think about whether we're going to require somebody to take to the floor to really talk about the issue and give the reasons why you support or oppose a particular issue. Another way to deal with it would be to flip the numbers. So right now, you have to have 60 votes to pass something. Well, let's make it 40 votes to prevent it, because that puts the onus on the people who are trying to keep something from happening.
But, you know, I've heard it said often that if you really had to have a filibuster, then there would be fewer filibusters. But when Ted Cruz took to the floor and recited Dr. Seuss, I don't recall people celebrating that as a moment of civic, you know, improved civic discourse in Washington. It only angered people further. Where, I guess what I'm asking is the same question I put to David. Where are the signs of hopefulness here? That is, where do you see the encouragement that we can go from, well, we've had a more than a decade and 3 presidencies that failed to pass an immigration law that would have repaired an obviously broken system. Does COVID-19 change that at all? Does it make people more serious about legislating?
I think it's too soon to know the answer to that. You know, I remember being in college in the 1960s and being opposed to the Vietnam War and engaging with my political science professor over the fact that we have tens of thousands of people marching in the streets. Why wasn't the American policy on the Vietnam War changing? And he said to me, when enough people get upset enough about what's going on in the country, then the policies are going to change. And while certainly as an adult and as somebody who's involved in politics, it often takes a lot longer for that to happen than I would like for it to. But I do think that's part of our democracy. And if we can allow it to work, then, and we can get people engaged in it, then we will see policies that reflect where the majority of our voters are. But what we've done is we've allowed changes that really affect the ability of voters to have their voices heard. And I would argue that one of the major ways that has happened is through our campaign finance system. That the Citizens United decision that says that corporations are people, that the increasing amounts of money that are in our system are corrupting it in ways that have a real corrosive effect on our democracy.
I'm going to ask you one question on a completely different subject. Because we're doing this for the Rabin Medical Center, which is in Israel, the Trump administration would describe itself as the most pro-Israel administration that has ever existed. Is Israel a controversial subject within the Democratic Party? Might annexation of the West Bank, in fact, jeopardize relations between Israel and a government in which the Democratic Party was in the majority?
Most of the Democrats who I have talked to are concerned about efforts to annex the West Bank because it totally undercuts the idea of a two-state solution to the problems between Israel and the Palestinians. And I share that view. I think it would be, I think the solution to Israel and the Palestinians is still a two-state solution, but the time is running out very quickly on that. An annexation of the West Bank would certainly be a death knell, I fear, to the idea that we could have a two-state solution.
And one other domestic question. You've won a lot of elections. The one you lost, which included people they were convicted of dirty tricks against you.
Right.
But they also ran against you for having raised a tax when you were governor. New Hampshire is not a great state in which to raise taxes. Given that we've just passed some $1 trillion bills, and that there's talk of repealing, obviously Democrats want to repeal the Trump tax cut. Are Americans ready to pay for a new era of government that addresses the problems we share these days?
Well, I think today Americans are just worried about putting food on the table and paying their rent. And every economist that I've talked to has said that now is not the time to talk about paying down the debt and worrying about the deficit. Now is the time to ensure that people can have a job, that they can, that kids can go back to school, that people can get the basic needs that every family wants. And that's where I think we've got to be focused. And that's why I've been supportive of the various legislative packages to deal with the coronavirus, why I think we've got to have another one, because kids aren't going to go back to school unless school districts get help. People aren't going to be able to send their kids back to childcare unless childcare centers get help. Small businesses still need help if they're going to continue to get stood up and hire back all of their employees. So we've still got a lot of work to do. And the first thing we've got to do is defeat this coronavirus. And that means we need more testing, more contact tracing. We need a plan in Washington that we still have not seen, even though, you know, this has been going on. We've known it was a problem since February. We still don't have a plan for how to address that. And what we're hearing now from this president is that he doesn't believe we need any more testing. Well, I was just in New Hampshire last week at a testing site where they told me that our test results are getting delayed in New Hampshire because so many of the tests coming from hotspots out in the south and west are going to our testing labs in New Hampshire, which is delaying the results that we're getting. So this is related to all of us. We all better understand that we're in the same boat when it comes to this coronavirus, and we've got to have a plan that's going to help everybody get out of it, and that will allow us to address those other items on David Brooks' list of challenges that we're facing in this country.
Well, Senator Jeanne Shaheen, stick around because in about 10 minutes we'll be taking questions from attendees. Thank you very much. Our next guest is deeply interested in restoring trust in the information that we see and read about politics, particularly the information on Facebook. After several years as a CIA officer, at one time she was assigned to Vice President Joe Biden, Yael Eisenstadt signed on as Facebook's head of global elections integrity operations. She was concerned about how the social media giant disseminates political information and misinformation. A few months later, she left, warning that Facebook's very business model exacerbates the problem of fake news and ideological echo chambers. Yael Eisenstadt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. I suppose a defender of the Facebook business model would say Mark Zuckerberg's not a publisher or an editor. He's more like the custodian of the town square, or he's the telephone company, which we don't hold responsible for everything that's said on the telephone. People are exercising the First Amendment when they publish on Facebook. What's wrong with that claim?
You went right to the heart of the matter, my favorite question. So to understand why that's so important to decide if they're a publisher or not is because, in fact, as long as they are not classified as anything other than a neutral intermediary, they have this blanket immunity from bearing any responsibility for the content on their platform. Now, why that's problematic is I absolutely agree that the First Amendment means that the government cannot intrude on people's right to free speech. First and foremost, this is a private company, so it's a slightly different situation. But more importantly, there's a big difference between having the freedom to say what you want online and having a company amplify what you say to as many as 3 billion people. And so those are two very different things. And while Facebook, I actually don't think Facebook should necessarily be responsible for every piece of content. I don't want Mark Zuckerberg to be the arbiter of truth. I don't want him to be the one deciding what is true and what is false. However, because of the business model and way the company is set up, what it means is their algorithms' number one goal is to keep you on their platform, right? That way they hoover up all your data. They're able to profile you into these smaller and smaller segments so that they can target you with ads, so that they know if you're more likely to respond to a Reebok ad or a Nike ad. Now, why is that a problem? Because the algorithms have figured out that in order to keep us engaged, they have to send us, they keep boosting more and more salacious content. And so for me, the idea of responsibility, the idea of, I actually don't think they should be classified as a publisher either. I think they're a whole new category, and it's some sort of like a digital curator. Their company, their algorithms decide who it's amplifying, whose voices are getting the most play. And in fact, it's often suppressing voices of people who don't want to play the salacious clickbait game, right? It's actually amplifying. It's not amplifying someone because they're the biggest expert. It's not amplifying someone because they are giving fact-checked, reasoned debate or stories. It's amplifying people because that content keeps you engaged. So to me, the bigger question is not, are they a publisher or are they a platform? My question is, should they bear responsibility for if their recommendation engines recommend more conspiracy theories than news?
Right. Well, look, let me play the defender of the business model. One more question. Is what you're describing really the same thing, though, that the editor of the New York Post over here and the Guardian over there have been doing for decades to find the stories that they think their readers will be most attracted to, and then get those people to also see the advertising in the paper? But that's been happening at human speed. Now it's happening at hypernormal speed. Is it simply the technology that is the problem here, and the power of that technology?
So that's a great question, because obviously before this business model, there were gatekeepers and you know, I know you are from a media background, but I do think there is a good side to having more voices be part of the conversation than just completely traditional gatekeepers. I think that's a real positive, but it is a different system, because whereas a newspaper, obviously they want to decide what they're going to put above the fold, behind the fold, what stories they're going to print, and they want their ads to be relevant, maybe by zip code, by where this newspaper is going. Very different than a machine that is actually using your human behavioral data, both from what you are doing on their platform and inferred behavior, and tracks you all over the internet, and then segments you into these smaller and smaller categories so that ads can really hyper target you. And I want to explain why that's so important. You know, in political discourse, for example, which, to be really clear, that's what brought me to Facebook to begin with, was 5 years ago, I felt that the breakdown in civil discourse was the biggest threat to our democracy. Having spent most of my career in the counter-extremism world, this felt more dangerous. But, you know, we have an election coming up. The way Facebook explains it is that political speech is already the most scrutinized speech in the world. That is their response to why they will not fact-check political candidates on their platform. And I would argue, yes, I would like political speech to be the most scrutinized speech in the world. But when a politician can run thousands, tens of thousands of different versions of an ad, micro-targeted to a level where you and I might live across the street from each other, but we're not even seeing the same ad, we can't come together and debate that content. And so that's one major thing. And then the way the platform gets manipulated is political operatives. In 2016, it was the Russians. Now we're seeing it's more and more sort of domestic political actors. They can exploit that in such dangerous ways. Like, for example, they can target you. I mean, for me right now, one of the biggest concerns is how voter suppression is going to play out on the platform. And let's say somebody wanted to target people not just by the city they live in, and they can't target you necessarily by race because that's too obvious, but they can target you by people who liked this particular page. Let's say that particular page very much plays to a certain demographic. And then they target their ad about mail-in ballots and fraud and all these whatever they want to say to that same group, where no one else is seeing that. That's a hugely concerning issue.
But you would say, I'm trying to think how you try to remedy the situation or solve what you perceive to be the problem. You're saying you don't want Mark Zuckerberg or anybody else to be the arbiter of what's true and what their subscribers can see, what their members can see. An alternative would be to simply ban these algorithms that connect information with targeted recipients, which seems unlikely to me, but it might be effective. If indeed those aren't effective responses to what the problem is, what is an effective response to the problem?
So there's sort of the immediate, because we have an election coming up, and then the longer term goals of what I think would be effective. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to figure out how to put together packages of smart legislation. Let's be clear. This is the only industry that has never had their responsibility defined. They continue in 2020, except for in the most extreme cases or in cases of intellectual property, to have free reign and no responsibility. They can say, we're so sorry this happened, but there's still been zero accountability for what happened with the Russians in 2016 on these platforms. So first and foremost, I do think we absolutely need smart legislation, and it's a package. There's not one piece of magical legislation that's going to fix everything. The number one thing for me is about transparency, because I'm not saying get rid of the algorithms and make it all human review. That's impossible. I do think, though, that they operate in a black box. And if you could build in some sort of transparency requirement around the recommendation engines, and just let me walk you through a really quick example if I can. So there's this group called the Boogaloo Boys. They're getting more prominence now. They basically advocate civil war. Many would describe them as a white supremacist group. There's lots of ways to describe this group. Two of the Boogaloo Boys are actually responsible for killing a federal officer in Oakland by exploiting the Black Lives Matters protests, and they killed a federal officer. So here's my question. Do you think Facebook should be responsible for the fact that Boogaloo Boys content is on their platform? Now, I can see both sides of that argument, right? Freedom of speech, and I agree with that. Freedom of speech, I don't know if we should shut them down. Okay.
Well, we have a concept of it. We have a concept of incitement, which is a
but even worse. These two men met in a Boogaloo Boys group on Facebook. That's where they met each other, and they hashed out their plan via Messenger, according to court documents. So my second question is, okay, even if you believe that they have the First Amendment right to say whatever they want on the platform, do you think the platform should be held responsible if for the fact that they met in a group, in a private group? And more importantly, what if we found out that their recommendation engine is the one that introduced one or two of those men into that Facebook group, that they weren't even looking for it to begin with? And that's the question that we'll never have the answer to, because there is no requirement for Facebook to be transparent about their recommendation engines or their algorithms. And so I think transparency is a huge piece of it. And then we could decide what are the rules of the road for what we want to hold them accountable for.
Would transparency amount to a long scroll of a very small print that, like so many other disclosures that we confront in commercial life, go by, we click on them, okay, I agree with that. Hardly anybody.
I don't mean transparency for us, to be clear. This goes into the debate of responsibility and Section 230 and all these things. It's a question of, if we defined that there had to be transparency around how the recommendation engines, what content was recommended versus what was organically found, then you could have some sort of a government oversight board that has access to that data. I don't mean that I should be able to look up every single thing. Why did this person see this content? But right now, again, so here's the biggest issue. There's no checks and balances right now on the companies. So right now, there's so many people screaming about hate on Facebook and hate groups and all of this. Normally, the mechanisms in the United States, a board, first of all, should be able to put their CEO in check. They can't at Facebook because of their dual class structure. The public should have some sort of mechanism, often through shareholder resolutions. Shareholders have no power because of their dual class structure. Advertisers, they're the money engines. We're starting to see them step up. But as Mark Zuckerberg was caught on tape saying last week, they'll be back because he basically has the monopoly over where they can advertise. So the last one would be the free market. People love to say the free market will always correct. Well, when the FTC fined Facebook $5 billion last summer for data privacy violations, the market rallied and their stock soared that very day because they said, you got away with it. $5 billion is pocket change and you didn't really have to change anything. Right. So in my opinion, the only group that can really affect this right now is to figure out how to create smart legislation that creates a healthier info ecosystem, creates transparency around how they operate, but still allows for the flourishing of social media.
Yael Eisenstadt, who's now a visiting fellow at Cornell Tech, stay with us, because now it's time for questions from our attendees. And I hope that all of you out there have been sending us. Here's a question that we have as we bring back our earlier guests, David Brooks and Jeanne Shaheen. An attendee asks, Senator Shaheen, what public policies need to be legislated immediately to help with turning the tide versus COVID-19?
Well, as I said, what we need is more support for states so that they can continue to do testing and contact tracing, which is really important. They need help with, I think states need help with state and local government relief because they're responding to COVID-19 and needing to put together plans. And right now, we're not really providing help for them at the state and local level as we think about the next package. Obviously, we need to continue to support the effort to develop a vaccine and all of the research that goes along with that. So that's where I would start.
Okay. A question for David Brooks. How do we deal with issues in which cancel culture might conflict with the First Amendment?
Go with the First Amendment. It's a simple answer. What's happening is that the parameters of what's sayable are shifting. And sometimes that's inevitable and sometimes that's good. New voices are coming into the debate. African Americans have not had as much voice as they should. They're coming into the debate. The problem is that a lot of people are defining very narrowly what's sayable in their platform. So for example, this week at the New York Magazine, Andrew Sullivan, a very prominent and I think an extremely good columnist, was let go because his brand of liberalism is outside of what's sayable on that platform. Readers have an intolerance to be disturbed. And so the bad news is that guy has no voice on that platform. The good news is he goes off to Substack, a new platform online where people can pay writers directly, and he immediately gets 60,000 subscribers. He's immediately financially viable. And so what's happening is people who are heterodox, who would get kicked out of a normal media platform because of how narrow it's becoming, can find another platform and another way to reach readers outside the established structures. So the bad news is the narrowing of debate, which is certainly happening, the climate of fear and uncertainty, but the opening up of new options, because there's so many people who do want open debate.
Yael, this is a question for you. How should Facebook deal with conspiracy theorists who use its platform to promote its views and candidates for public office?
Ooh, the candidates for public office go straight to this, probably the QAnon debacle that we are currently in. But listen, conspiracy theories, obviously part of what's so complicated is who's going to fact check, how are you going to figure out what is a conspiracy theory and what is not. That said, as I mentioned about the algorithms, the amount of conspiracy theories that are getting amplification from these platforms because they have figured out how to game the algorithms is really concerning. So this actually goes back to my recommendation about transparency, because if Facebook could say very easily, we're trying to take down sites like the QAnon sites, Twitter announced that, not Facebook so much, or we're trying to take down other conspiracy theory sites, we just have to believe them. Whereas if we had transparency around what, and again, I just mean for some sort of government oversight committee, let's look at the anti-vax community, for example. Or no, let's even look at Plandemic, because at the end of the day, someday we're gonna have a COVID-19 vaccine and half of this country's not gonna trust it enough to take it. And so Plandemic was a video, a conspiracy theory about vaccines and about COVID-19, and it spread like wildfire on Facebook. I believe that if we had a report that showed how many people found that video because they organically looked for it, and how many found it because Facebook's algorithm amplified it or recommended it, it would be a forcing mechanism for Facebook to have to clean up that part of its platform.
Now, I see Senator Jeanne Shaheen nodding in what I think is agreement. Do you regard this, Senator Shaheen, as an area for legislative oversight, or for legislation for that matter, to regulate the way that Facebook connects people with messages?
Well, I do think, based on what Yael said, that there are a lot of places there where we need to take a look at how social media is operating, Facebook, Twitter, other platforms. But the other piece that we haven't really talked about is how we educate the audience for all of these efforts. Because that's been one of the challenges, and that struck me when we looked at the Russian interference in our elections in 2016, that people didn't know what to look for. They didn't think that the information that they were getting might be manipulated. And it's one of the things we got to think about as we're thinking about how do we advise people that they need to watch where information is coming from. They need to figure out if that information is accurate, if it's being manipulated by somebody, who's the source. All of that is something that we haven't really begun to address at all, in addition to any regulations of social media platforms. So I think that's a piece of it too. And we're seeing some other countries, in Italy, for example, one of the things that they've done is begin to try and introduce a curriculum that helps people recognize when they're getting misinformation or disinformation. And we got to think about how we're going to address that.
David, where does your strong First Amendment support figure in all of this? I mean, is there a role for the conspiracy theorists to be blocked from access to audiences?
I'm sorry, I missed part of the question.
That is it appropriate to stand between the plandemic group or the anti-vaccine people and them reaching a public, or them being projected by say Facebook to the public? Or do you still stand by the First Amendment and say that's life? You know, that's
more or less. One area I think I disagree with the IL was I don't think Facebook, if the Boogaloo Boys, if two individuals from the Boogaloo Boys are killing somebody, I don't think Facebook is really responsible there. Like, we just had this horrible killing of the judge's son, and he had some paranoid, crazy Trump conspiracy manifesto, and I don't think it's the responsibility of wherever he put that manifesto up, or even if he met other people who believe in the manifesto, I don't think it's the responsibility of the platform, the publishing house, to sort of be held responsible for the horrible thing he did. People do crazy things and they should be held responsible. I will say that I don't think you can talk people out of conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theories flow because they have intense distrust of the world around them. They feel that somebody must be in control. And then they feel superior when they can have a sense of certainty that they understand what's really going on. And so it's the emotional crisis that produces the conspiracy. I'm really reminded, Yelkin knows this and could talk to it better than I, but I covered the Middle East quite a lot. And I used to think in Iraq War, we went to democratize the Middle East, but we ended up Middle Easternizing our democracy because the conspiracy theories that are often so common there are now here. And the only thing I tell people is, with all due respect to everybody, I've covered the power elite of this country for a long time. They're not competent enough to pull off a conspiracy.
I thought
it would leak. And so I disbelieve all conspiracy.
I'm going to let Yael answer that briefly, and then we'll get on to another question. Yes, Yael.
Just 2 quick points. I agree with David that I don't think Facebook should be responsible for if somebody sees something on Facebook and in the real world goes and does something. The area where I said we need to look into is, what if we found out that those people weren't even looking for that group and that group was recommended to them, or they were recommended to connect with each other? That's the point that I'm more concerned with. And I agree, conspiracy theories, it is very hard to talk someone out of a conspiracy theory, right? I used to actually run a lot of our Hearts and Minds work overseas during my government days. And the difference here is, it was much easier in a way because we actually sat down and had conversations, and we actually sat down and listened to each other, and and that doesn't exist anymore. But my concern is not that I don't blame social media for everything that's happening, but it is a tool that is exploiting our deepest vulnerabilities and then targeting us with information that confirms those deepest vulnerabilities, breaks down that trust, and then opens us up by pushing conspiracy theories at us. I mean, you look at a new moms group on Facebook, and there's evidence showing that immediately they were all targeted with anti-vax ads when they were in a new moms group for support from other new moms. these are the things that concern me. Not that Facebook's responsible for the fact that there's conspiracy theories in the world, but the scale at which their machine is exploiting our human vulnerabilities to pull us even further into being vulnerable to those theories.
I'm going to take us to another question right now. This is from attendee Warren Diamond, who asks, well, he asks all panelists, although I put the question about Israel to Senator Shaheen. Do you think moving the embassy to Jerusalem, which was promised to the American people by President Trump, hurt the chances of peace in the Middle East? And I'd like to hear from everybody. Senator Shaheen, do you think so?
Well, I was certainly worried that when the embassy was moved, there would be a much greater reaction among the Arab neighbors to Israel, and we did not see that. I think if there is a real commitment on both the Israeli and Palestinian sides of this disagreement to come up with a two-state solution, that they could resolve the embassy as part of that. So I think there are lots of obstacles that have been put up that have prevented or been cited as the reason why there hasn't been a settlement or a resolution. But a lot of it has, I think, leadership. It's about leadership there as well, that if we had leaders on both sides who really wanted to see a resolution, were willing to negotiate and help their publics with the decision-making, that would not be an impediment to ultimately resolving the situation.
Let me ask first, Yael and David, both briefly. Do you think moving the embassy to Jerusalem damaged the chances of peace?
Wow, now I'm going to put on my former policy hat. I kind of want to plead the fifth a little bit, but I hope not. I think part of the question is what the motive was for doing it. If it was truly because this administration really believes that it was the right thing to do for the Middle East, that would be one thing. But the motive behind it is what I personally don't trust. So I'm not going to get too deep into this one. I like Senator Shaheen's answer.
You think it may have been to get a lot of evangelical votes back home, perhaps? David Brooks,
very political.
Do you think it was a danger to peace, the chances of peace, such as they are?
Well, first, I think we should have got something for it from the Israelis. We gave the Israelis a big gift. They should have given us something back. Second, I do think it's the right move. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And so acknowledging reality, I think, is genuinely a smart thing. But while you acknowledge that reality, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, you have to acknowledge another reality, that Ramallah and Hebron and Nablus are parts of a Palestinian homeland. And that's why Senator Shaheen is so right to keep emphasizing the two-state solution. And so my basic approach is just acknowledge the realities that are on the ground and try to build a political solution around what actually exists.
Here's a question for you. Could David Brooks discuss America's current position where, according to Real is their attendee, where most other countries view America as an object of pity, unable to act collectively, as opposed to the leader of the West and the rallying force for combating enemies, both viral and military in nature? I don't know if you agree with that assessment, David, but the question is, what do you think?
Yeah, certainly I've heard a lot of it from friends abroad that Trump was seen as an embarrassment enough, but our collective performance comes to seem like the decline of the American nation state. I don't think that's baked in. I don't think that's permanent. I think we can recover. But this is a moment where there's been a tremendous loss of confidence. I see it in Congress. I just read a speech from Senator Sheen's colleague, Josh Hawley from Missouri. And it was about how America should stop playing a big role in the world. We don't have to take care of ourselves. And that's a loss of confidence. And President Trump has withdrawn from the world. And so we have a loss of confidence based on a loss of confidence in ourselves.
But isn't that one of the oddities of the year of the pandemic, which is that one of the steps that the government took in response to the pandemic was to close off contact with the outside world. If there ever were an argument to say we want to know absolutely everybody who's crossing the border into the country, it's when there's a virus for which we have no therapeutic and no vaccine on the loose. Oddly, the events of the pandemic seem to reinforce isolationism.
Yeah, well, I covered the end of the Soviet Union, and I covered in those years, I covered the Oslo peace process. I covered Mandela coming out of prison, the reunification of Germany, the EU Maastricht Treaty, the coming together. And the great theme of those years was convergence, barriers falling, us converging. The great theme of the last 25 years has been walls and barriers. And this is not only an American problem. I think Macron, the French Prime Minister, President, gave a very forceful interview this week saying the EU project, it's over. That even in the EU project, they all went into the nation state. And so China is now going to have their own stack of industries. We're going to have a separate stack of industries. And so we are re-entering what looks like a period of 19th century great power competition, which is not how it looked in 1991.
Okay, I have one last question, which you'll have to be very brief with before we turn to Tel Aviv for a couple of minutes at the end. But Marty Isaac asks to all of you, what's your recommendation? What's your number one recommendation, I'll say, to improve life in the United States? So there's this one hell of a short answer question. Yael Eisenstadt.
No, I'm up first.
What's the one thing that you would want to see changed most?
I don't know if I would say most because there's many, but I'll just say one thing that's relevant for right now. I would really love to see a resurgence of a public service mindset or of a little bit more collective. I mean, I know that the United States is really built on individualism, on freedom to be completely individual, but we are in a crisis right now that absolutely requires us to either consider the plight of our neighbors, whether we agree with them or not. So what could make our country better is if we could figure out, both through civil discourse that Senator Shaheen and David Brooks mentioned before, how to get back to a slightly more, I consider it patriotic, thinking about the United States and our fellow Americans in a more collective way.
And David Brooks, you have your one magic wand wave.
I run a project called Weave, the Social Fabric Project, and what we do is we give money, resources, and attention to people who live in the neighborhoods that they serve to rebuild community. And they are morally uplifting, but they're actually doing the thing I've been talking about all hour, which is rebuilding trust at the local level. So if somewhere in your town, there's a marginalized community, and somewhere in that community, there are people who live in that community, who serve the kids in that community, the homeless in that community, the drug addicts in that community, and they are the future, and they are the best solution for what this society needs.
And Senator Shaheen?
Well, David, I think that's a wonderful project, but my answer is easy to this. I think we need to elect a new president.
I think, and that is certainly to the point. Senator Jeanne Shaheen, David Brooks of the New York Times, Yael Eisenstadt of Cornell Tech. Thanks to all of you very much for taking part in this web seminar. We have one more brief check-in or check-up right now before we sign off, and that's with Dr. Michael Drescher of Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Israel. He directs the emergency department there. He divides his time between Israel and Connecticut. And Mike Drescher, it's good to see you again. You've become our house doctor here in dealing with this. When we spoke in June, the pandemic seemed to have cooled down a bit, both in Israel and the US. You were looking forward to school reopening in Israel. The graph of COVID-19 cases in Israel since then has been heading straight up. What has happened? You're muted, Mike, so we have to unmute you.
Sorry about that.
Sure.
Nice to see you again, Robert.
Good to
And
see you.
I want to begin by saying, before I answer your question, which I will, I want to thank the American Friends of the Rabin Medical Center, being that I run the emergency department there, and really the fact that you're taking your time, and Senator Shaheen, David Brooks, and Yael Eisenstadt have taken some time for this project, I think is wonderful. And I want to thank you personally and in the name of the Rabin Medical Center, and to thank Josh Plout and the American Friends for organizing it. Now to answer your question, well, yes, we were waiting for schools to open, and indeed they did. And that was probably the sentinel event for what people are calling the second wave, or the continuation of the spread of the COVID virus in Israel. We're seeing a definite spread. We've had over, at the height of the last wave, several hundred a day. Now we're seeing almost 2,000 new cases a day. However, we are not seeing a large wave of very, very sick people. For instance, like you had in New York City at the time, or Milan, or in Spain. We are seeing people who are quite ill, but not in great numbers, and that is due to various factors. But that's kind of where things are now. Many people are becoming infected, but we as our medical system is so far not overwhelmed with sick people. We're overwhelmed with people that are not that ill.
And in terms of contact tracing, I know there's been controversy over the Shin Bet, the security branch, using its resources to track who's been in touch with whom. How effective has it been when there's an outbreak? Are you able to find the source of that particular infection?
Well, there's a lot of debate about that, both at the level of kind of principle, like how comfortable are we with this being used as a tool, kind of in the privacy sense, et cetera. But once having gotten past that and just looking at it technically, even there's a big question. A lot, the way this works is that if your telephone is in proximity to somebody who later on was found to be infected, you then get a message and you are to be quarantined. Well, this is a very blunt instrument, where you, in fact, in the hospital, if you're working in the hospital and there's somebody who was known to be ill, you'll get a message. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So although it does have power to locate people, it is also a blunt instrument and is not that exact. There's another facet to it, which is people are starting to turn off their phones. They don't really want to be tracked. So you're walking around, and so there's a lot of aspects to this. It's not a panacea, certainly.
And what you're saying is the problem isn't only epidemiological or medical. The problem is also social in terms of people's values and what they accept.
As many other aspects of this plague pandemic are.
Well, Dr. Drescher, it's great to talk with you again, and thanks.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks for updating us.
And thanks again for hosting.
I have some thank yous to offer to other folks, to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, and Rona Giuliano of the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It is, by the way, a 501c3 nonprofit, which represents Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in the US. The website is www.afrmc.org. Also, thanks to our Global Connections partner, Yuval Rose of Digital Asset, and Yuval's team. Save the date. Our next Global Connections, a national virtual forum, is Wednesday, August 26th, from 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern Time. As you can see, it's 10 to 11 a.m. roughly Eastern Time, with Robert Zimmer, who's the president of the University of Chicago, and other guests, talking about the challenges facing education during the COVID-19 pandemic. You can register at globalconnections.splashthat.com. That's globalconnections.splashthat.com. Please invite your colleagues and friends to join us, and we'll see you next month at Global Connections, Navigating the New Abnormal. I'm Robert Siegel. Stay healthy and stay safe. Bye-bye.